I'm very glad to have you, Dr. Mark Fox, here joining us today to talk about what I guess is a topic that is on the lips of everybody, because the new series of Uncanny started a couple of weeks ago. One of the main stories, what kind of gripped the imagination and has sent Danny Robbins into stardom, of course, was the first series. The first story was The Witch Farm. And you have some interesting discussions about that to be had. So, Mark Fox, can I ask you to come to take to the stage and we'll have a chat about your presentation here tonight?
Okay. Hi.
But no, it's good. Thank you very much for coming to join us here today. Thursday night is a wonderful time to share a great conversation. So, Mark, it's been, like I said, it's been since November 2023. And I think what I was saying to you a few minutes ago, it doesn't feel like it's been a couple of months.
I know. That's a Grateful Dead once sang. Where does the time go?
Indeed, indeed. So, Uncanny. Has this been a show that you've been watching lately? Are you gripped?
Yeah, I kind of dip into it. I don't watch it sort of religiously. I mean, it was the same with the podcasts and the TV series. Now and again, I find some of them more interesting than others. There's no doubt in the success of the Uncanny franchise. I think Danny Robbins has done a lot of good work publicising some of these issues, and yeah, I enjoy the stuff that he's done by and large.
Yeah, same here. I have majority listened to the audio. I've only caught one of the TV shows that they've done. So, it's a really good show. And I think it's brought a level head to investigating the paranormal or just touching those subjects, the team skeptic, team believer, and keeping it fair and honest and kind of keeping it open for the audience to interpret. That actually has been his winning formula.
Yeah, and he stuck with it. Why change a winning team? And yeah, I think it is a very engaging franchise, and I've learned a lot from it.
Okay, I'll let you take it away then. Let's learn about Witch Farm.
Okay, thank you. And tonight's talk is which farm is the Witch Farm? Testimony and the Uncanny at Heol Fanog. When a case is referred to as the Welsh Amityville, you wonder quite what's being implied. Is it a case so convincing, so utterly compelling that it proves the existence of supernatural realities once and for all, or B, a case so riven with weakness and contradiction that it isn't, as the saying goes, worth the candle? With Amityville, it turned out to be absolutely emphatically B. What then of the case in question this evening? One which occurred over 2 decades ago at a place called Heol Fanog, latterly dubbed the Witch Farm. I first found myself wondering this during the autumn and winter of 2022 as I listened to the Witch Farm, an 8-part BBC podcast series hosted by Danny Robbins and purported, as one of the episode titles proclaimed, to be presenting a case worthy to be dubbed the Welsh Amityville. As regards all things paranormal, as we've already been hearing in the discussion earlier, Robbins has form quite apart from the Witch Farm. He presented the wildly popular Uncanny podcast since 2021, BBC television series in 2023 and one current, an Uncanny touring roadshow, a book into the Uncanny, and before the Uncanny brand took off, a popular podcast dealing with the famous or infamous Battersea poltergeist. On a roll, Robbins unveiled The Witch Farm on the 17th of October 2022, and it ran until the 5th of December that same year. Some bonus episodes followed, but all told, this baffling case still left many listeners with more questions than answers. Having found myself haunted, pun intended, by this Welsh Amityville, I embarked on a sustained process of research and reflection, one which ran for long after the series was becoming an ever more distant memory. As I will seek to show this evening, this particular case has much to teach us, and I will explore in what follows the case in detail, going beyond the podcast to explore additional material in a bid to shed fresh light on what remains a baffling case. A close look at the credits for the witch farm reveals that it had a consultant, Mark Chadbourne, author of a book on the case called Testimony. Remember that title. Chadbourne, a screenwriter and one-time journalist, is also a writer of supernatural thriller and fantasy novels, which explains why Testimony is such a gripping read and why perhaps The Witch Farm was such a gripping listen. Indeed, book and podcast, as you might expect, contain various similarities, but also, interestingly, some differences. As with the book on which it was based, the podcast interspersed dramatic reconstructions of the events at Heol Fanog with actual testimony from those directly involved, including Liz Rich, of which more later. Because of time constraints, however, Robbins was unable during his podcasts to provide the level of detail contained in the book. For anyone interested in getting to the truth behind the events at Heol Fanog, therefore, both book and podcasts are indispensable, as well as some key additional material, as I will show. What happened at Heol Fanog then? In essence, over a period of several years, commencing in late November 1989, a family was terrorised at an isolated house in the shadow of the Brecon Beacons. Phenomena were allegedly many and varied. Heavy footsteps, inexplicable smells of sulphur and incense, unexplained electricity drains, a repeated sense of an evil presence, a sinister sense of being watched, appearances of black silhouette-like figures, multiple apparitions, terrifying dreams, an unexplained run of atrocious luck, and so on. Indeed, the variety of manifestations seems to have been matched only by the range of experts involved to rid the house of them. Spiritualists, Baptists, lay people, dowsers, exorcists, various members of the Society for Psychical Research, and so on, in a depressing and mostly futile parade. Help sometimes came, but it never seemed to last. Ultimately been responsible for their woes, one thing is abundantly clear, both from the podcast and the book. The Rich family, Bill, Liz, and during the early stages, Bill's son Lawrence, clearly suffered from something at least. In the later stages of the manifestations, even the family dog Bo is claimed to have been affected. Hence, by the end of his recounting of the family's horrifying nearly 6-year ordeal, Chadbourne, in his book Testimony, is bullish. For in addition to the Riches themselves, he writes, there are ample testimonies from others, including, and I quote, a previous resident, the dog warden, and all the spiritual leaders. Were they all, he writes, lying, misguided, or the victims of some strange brain defect? And overall, he concludes, and again I quote, to say all this was all some delusion is actually more unbelievable than to accept that something terrible and beyond the bounds of reason happened at Heol Fanog. the truth, as is often the case with alleged paranormal infestations, may, however, be somewhat more complex. For me, as I read his book Testimony, were the number of people who had lived in or been associated with Heol Fanog over the years who reported absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. A local historian, whom the author consulted about the events, claims not to have known of anything unusual about the farm. The Riches rented, and Chadbourne quotes the actual owner as claiming, quote, "I've never heard of anything unusual, and that I'm not aware of anything strange happening at Heol Fanog. None of the previous residents have said." A local builder claims in similar vein that "I've never felt any of the bad atmosphere. It just seemed like a normal house to me." Whilst the local dog warden reportedly could find nothing wrong with the dog. Most telling of all is the testimony of one Bridget Buscombe, a long-time resident of the house for several years before the Riches took up tenancy, who is quoted by Chadbourne as saying, "I loved that house and felt very happy there. I left there reluctantly, and it's always been my favourite house of all the ones I've lived in. If I had the money, I'd buy it." More recently, prompted by the podcast series, the current residents at Heol Fanog contacted Danny Robbins to reveal that not only had the electricity drains failed to occur for the whole 21st century, but also that the gentle mystery of nature was the only mysterious thing about the farm. Asserting that they had been resident at Heol Fanog for the past 25 years, they appeared overall to be more than happy to report no supernatural or other unusual phenomena at all. Consistent testimony then. And finding space for such first-person telling is one of the absolute strengths of both Chadbourne's book and the Witch Farm podcast. And yet, there are twists even here. Footsteps running along the landing upstairs when the house was empty. And even Bridget Buscombe, long time and apparently happy resident at Heol Fanog, having told Chadbourne that it was her favourite house, has a postscript. "And suddenly heard a noise, so I looked up. I had an old spinning wheel in one corner, and the wheel was going round, just going round of its own accord. I jumped out of bed and stuffed a piece of paper in the wheel to stop it. Why did it happen? I couldn't explain it." So, there is clearly counter evidence to the nothing out of the ordinary testimonies then, plus, of course, the massive and sustained testimony over the Riches over many years and other material which Chadbourne claims to have, but which he has, quote, "not been able to detail." Which farm, then, is or was the Witch Farm? The house of horrors where everything dreadful happens, or a lovely place where nothing does? To fully explain what happened at Heol Fanog, I'm going to suggest that we need to make a synthesis of two apparently contrasting possibilities in order to go deeper still. While reading Chadbourne's book, I was reminded of another account of an unusual event examined shortly before, unpublished and uncovered during research I was doing for another project. In the account, which I have yet to publish, the writer set out a series of terrifying or others in the Hope Valley in Derbyshire's Peak District. During her time at the cottage, according to the writer, the terrors she experienced were many and varied, including the presence of an evil entity, terrifying nightmares, unexplained, and so on. A list, in fact, remarkably like that reported by the Riches during their massively troubled time at Heol Fanog. In the Hope Valley case, which I found, the writer included enough information to enable me to track down the actual cottage, which is still in use as a holiday let. And I examined customer reviews of it on trip review sites going as far back as I was able, several years in fact. And what did I find? Not a single mention of anything terrifying, supernatural, or unpleasant at all. When confronted by such puzzles, how might we proceed? One option might simply be to discount supernatural interpretations of unusual events in favour of purely this-worldly ones, psychological ones or such like. In the Heol Fanog case, for example, we might agree with Dr. Kieran O'Keefe, who, responding to the podcast, suggested a psychological interpretation of the events of the farm, adding family stresses, prior experiences, possible fantasy proneness, and even the Chernobyl nuclear reactor disaster of 1986. We could add to this list similar cases of shared delusional states, or instances where faulty recollection has been shown to subsequently bestow on mundane events a very different affective hue. Thus, as much as we might sympathise with the Riches for being at the centre of it all, we might gently suggest another way of viewing the events at Heol Fanog. In extreme cases, we might even suggest fraud, although there is no hint of this in the case of the Riches. By direct contrast, we might incline toward the opposite point of view, that something overwhelming and clearly paranormal does occur in such odd cases, including the one involving the Riches, and that reductionistic interpretations are simply missing the point. We recall Chadbourne's own assertion in his book, "Too much happened to too many over too long at Heol Fanog to entertain any other hypothesis, let alone that the Riches lied." Much more sensible then, more believable, as he would have it, to conclude that something genuinely supernatural occurred, supernatural and terrifying. In short, then, and following Chadbourne's own lead, we might conclude that a supernatural explanation is to be preferred above any other as regards at least some of the events at Heol Fanog, or that it is at least reasonable to support such an explanation, to trust the witness's own interpretations of events, in other words, given the sheer weight of evidence that exists in favour of doing this. This allows us in turn to address a key question which I've already highlighted. What of those to whom nothing occurred at Heol Fanog? As we have seen, this was a sizable group. So, what should we do with their testimonies? Ignore them as of no consequence, or allow them to challenge the contention that there was a supernatural element to at least some of the events reported at the farm? I would like to suggest that a synthesis of two apparently contrasting possibilities offers the best way to resolve this dilemma. In seeking a total explanation for any set of allegedly paranormal events, such as those at Heol Fanog, it could be argued, and is frequently argued, that the location itself is significant above all. As is well known, this is a position most commonly associated with hauntings. Thus, a place as a place is said to be haunted. As a consequence, if you visit that place, you might experience phenomena you wouldn't experience elsewhere. Contrastingly, it could be said that person-centeredness and not place-centeredness is the important thing. As is also well known, this is a position often associated with poltergeists. Often the person, usually one single person, at the centre of such phenomena is known as a focus. That is, things happen in their vicinity precisely because they are there and attract them, which is frequently claimed in the case of Shirley Hitchings in the Battersea poltergeist case, as covered by Robbins at length. And one thing these foci are often said to have in common is that they are troubled in some way, often deeply, as in cases where their psychological tensions have no apparent physical outlet and manifest either as something else, or when the tensions lead the focus, unwittingly perhaps, to attract something else. Perhaps it is time to collapse the place or person dichotomy as we seek explanations for at least some paranormal manifestations and seek a synthesis instead. How might this work in the case of Heol Fanog? Well, in the normal run of things, it's an ordinary house. Nothing much happens there. Some people quite like it. Others love it. Occasionally something odd might happen, as with Bridget Buscombe's spinning wheel, but nothing terrifying. But when you add a particular dynamic to the location, a person or group of persons in a particularly troubled psychological state, for example, it is the equivalent of lighting the blue touch paper. A rarity to be sure, but one that can be sustained and dramatic. Is there any evidence that the Riches embodied such a dynamic? Chadbourne's book Testimony makes it clear, clearer even than the podcast, that they did, but as a family. Indeed, the opening chapters make very clear that when the key dramatis personae of the Heol Fanog case arrived at the house, they were a group of troubled persons seeking peace and solace, a perception that is reinforced when certain key pieces of podcast material are added. Early on, for example, Chadbourne asserts that Bill and Liz had found the home at the culmination of a very difficult period for both of them. In Bill's case, his wife of 16 years had recently left him for somebody else. Liz had battled anorexia for many years and had at one point run away to the Mediterranean, only to return depressed and suffering from ringworm and psittacosis. Seeking a cure and having turned to herbalism as part of the process, she eventually trained as a herbalist, meeting Bill when he sought her services to help cure him of his own depression. At first, Heol Fanog offered a way out from the couple's previous travails, a fresh start in a new home that provided a much-needed escape from their old one. As Chadbourne tells it, and I quote, When they heard of Heol Fanog, it was a moment of pure serendipity. They were at their lowest ebb, desperate to move out from their old home, unable to find anywhere. By the time the family arrived at the farm, Liz was 3 months pregnant, and at first all was well. But within weeks of the new baby's arrival, the phenomena started with the sounds of heavy footsteps, odours, and so on. Almost in tandem with this, it was Bill's son from his previous marriage, Lawrence, who would begin to show the signs of alienation and disturbance that would lead to his ultimate banishment from the house. Testimony, Chadbourne's book, gives ample evidence of this, in particular in its vivid descriptions of his bouts of anger, self-isolation, and depression, which gradually give way to increasing hostility and ever more troubling behaviour. There is clear evidence of prior tensions with Liz. By page 50, he is punching holes in his bedroom wall and spitting in his grandmother's and father's faces. Bill avows complete ignorance of the underlying causes, saying it was beyond anybody's understanding, but it is difficult to miss the timing of events. When baby Ben arrives, Lawrence's decline begins and the troubles start. Bill at least grasps this, admitting that he started to change about the time of the footsteps, but seemingly fails to grasp the more obvious connection. With the new baby's arrival, the family is changing, and poor Lawrence is becoming ever more peripheral. Rage follows in ever-increasing intensity until he is packed off to a boarding school where his condition, perhaps predictably, improves. The podcast adds the detail of Bill's descent into alcoholism, but even in the absence of this, it is clear that the family at the centre of events were deeply, deeply troubled for large parts of their tenancy at Heol Fanog. Indeed, it would be tempting to conclude that it was these unquiet souls that haunted the house, not the other way round. Save, of course, for the fact that so many of the events that occurred over the years appear to have come from somewhere or something else, and to have added massively to the tensions that already exist. So, what was really there? What was that something else? Given the events as described in both book and podcast, might we be able to say anything about the realities, even the mechanisms involved? From the detail in Chadbourne's book, it seems clear that whatever it was or is, was there well before the riches arrived. Others noticed it. It even gave the house-loving Bridget Buscombe what might be said to be a little tease. But only when the riches moved in did things really take off. In this context, one of the events that occurred after Lawrence left is particularly interesting, not least for the fact that it was one of the most terrifying of all. Liz Rich tells the story in her own words. As I stepped into the hallway, I had a real shock. I saw this black silhouette of a 7-foot man walking just on the inside of the kitchen door, just passing the doorway. I went into the kitchen and it wasn't there. I knew it wouldn't be there. That's why I went in. The figure had been there, certainly, but these things happen so quickly. I've never seen any of these face on for 5 minutes or so you can actually study them and work out pictures. It's always so quick. It was just black, no detail, black all black, everything, and it was male, just feelings. Chadbourne adds, it was as if that apparition had breached some invisible wall. From that moment on, the terror in the house grew rapidly worse. Liz's comment that such encounters were usually so quick reflects the fact that she was no stranger to seeing such glimpsed apparitions in and around the farm. This one seems to have stood out because of the detail involved, and it is that detail which bears comparison with other similar encounters. Consider, for example, the following description of a claimed experience that occurred in South Dakota on a trailer court at sunset one evening in 1985. Having tuned a car in preparation for a trip, the experienced writes, 2 trailers down from us, 2 women and a man were arguing in front of their trailer. They were so loud that we could hear everything they said. I reached down by my front tire to grab a ratchet from the toolbox, and I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. What I saw startled me. I froze. A small black thing was walking down the grass trail behind the trailers. That's the best way I can explain it. It was maybe 3 feet tall with skinny legs and arms. It had a faceless head and walked like a human. But it didn't look like a ghost or anything. It was black, as if there were a hole in the air, as if it were a nothingness swallowing light. I've never seen such complete blackness since. I don't think it noticed me. I watched in astonishment as it walked up to a tree about as big around as a coffee can and put its arm around the trunk and stood there watching the people who were arguing. I couldn't believe my eyes. The thing was so black that it looked as if the tree had a black hole in it. It seemed to be enjoying itself. Reflecting on why it could have been enjoying itself, the writer adds, maybe it liked anger. Maybe it brought anger. Aside from the reported height, this description of the figure encountered contains striking similarities to the one given by Liz and reproduced by Chadbourne. In each case, there is a figure, walking, featureless, black, a silhouette. Are these the only parallels? We recall the South Dakota writer's subsequent reflection above. Perhaps it liked anger or brought it. Given the context, the argument is going on before the figure appears, the former might suggest itself as preferable. Might this have been the case at Heol Fanog too? Not just in the case of the silhouette, but in respect of the rest of the phenomena also. Could there be a sense in which such things feed on tension, trouble, and disquiet, including the tension, trouble, and disquiet they sometimes add to the mix? As we have seen, and as both Chadbourne in his book and the Witch Farm podcast make abundantly clear, there was no shortage of such at Heol Fanog. In many unusual cases, we are presented with what seems an age-old paranormal dichotomy. Are places haunted or are people? As this talk nears its end, it is now time to ask, how might the Heol Fanog case help us resolve such a dichotomy? Can it? Given his age, it might be tempting to see Lawrence as the sole focus in the Heol Fanog case and to view all of the events as straightforward poltergeist phenomena centering on him. However, it is notable from testimony that the events continued long after he was packed off to live somewhere else. In fact, as we have seen in the case of Liz's silhouette encounter, in many ways they became more intense. But anyway, playing the blame game does nothing to advance our understanding of what happened at the farm during the troublesome years. To be the catalyst for something is not the same as to cause it, let alone to be the ultimate cause of it. Remember, something was really there at Heol Fanog and had been well before the riches arrived. They didn't ask for it. Far less did they want it. In fact, they did everything they could to get rid of it. And in the end, it seems they did. In the very last exchange of the original Witch Farm podcast, in the final moments of the final episode, Danny Robbins asks Liz Rich, "Why do you think this happened to you?" Her answer is telling. It's like making a cocktail, I guess. You've got to have certain ingredients for it to work right. And I guess Bill and I were the missing ingredients. I think maybe certain people carry a darkness that other people don't. The omission of any reference to Lawrence here is interesting, as is the purport of her parting reflection. It was us. We were the missing ingredient. This talk has suggested that catalyst might be a preferable metaphor to cocktail as regards the events that occurred at Heol Fanog, but either way, the conclusion that persons plus place has better explanatory value than persons or place is generally supported from somebody at the very centre of what happened. A synthesis, that is, rather than an either or. So, which farm was the witch farm? The answer appears to have been, it all depends on who was there. For some, it was a quiet place. For others, it was a lovely place. For still others, it was a place of horrors. It could be, by turns, teasing or terrifying. Take your pick. It was all of these and more.
Mark, thank you very much. That was incredibly insightful, and the way that you shared that story, and clearly you've put a lot of thought into how that was phrased and presented. That was a wonderful, great talk. I'm much appreciated. And people here are very much thanking you for that story, and it gives insight into this powerful story that many people didn't hear until Uncanny. Perhaps for those people who are unfamiliar with the story, I mean, how long ago did this occur?
How long ago did it occur? I think it started around about, was it 1989?
And how long did it go on for? Because
I think it was 6 years.
oh wow! So imagine living in a place that has that kind of almost air of strangeness at all times. You know, where you feel that you are never alone, and I can't imagine what that's like to live with because I don't experience anything like that. But clearly, those who live with a a presence, shall we say, must never feel comfortable even by themselves because they must feel that they're always being watched and always being potentially judged. And I think that makes us behave slightly differently. And I wonder if that is also feeding that kind of phenomena too.
Christian, can I just kind of butt in there? One thing that has become apparent to me from research that I've recently done, one thing that I've particularly become interested in is the motif of watching itself.
Mm,
And I think this is underreported, but particularly in the UFO literature,
sure.
the number of times that people who have close encounters will say the same or similar to this. I felt it was watching me. I felt it was watching me. That seems odd, actually, and it has begun to reinforce my contention as regards UFOs that they're not craft being piloted. They are the entities themselves. And one of the fundamental features of these entities is that they watch. And I think we have a similar thing really at Heol Fanog. This sense of being watched, whatever is causing this seemingly disparate array of phenomena actually at root has a kind of core, a number of core features, and the watching motif is absolutely there.
For sure. And you know that story, that sensation, that feeling, it's not a thing that's only been reported recently. It goes back a long time. And you certainly, I've listened to a lot of people who are in the UFO community, certainly in the UAP field, and those people who have come forward from the UFO task force in the US, and they talk about this very phenomenon, this something out of phase, watching people, maybe going back a long time. This is part of our psyche. But I still wonder, are we producing it, or are they really external?
It's really, really interesting because if you go back to, of all places, the Bible, Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 4, a really odd episode, which is actually ignored by many people who read the Bible, but it's that strange episode of where the sons of God come down to earth and reproduce with human women, and the offspring are known as the Nephilim,
For sure.
and they're giants, and God then sends the flood, and the belief becomes at the time of Jesus that the demons are in fact the disembodied souls of dead Nephilim. The interesting thing is these things that came down to earth are referred to in Aramaic as Irene, and Irene means the watchers.
Oh,
Now, somehow they decided to call these things the Watchers. Now, you got two possibilities there, it seems to me. Possibility number one, that they're kind of riffing on the notion that these kind of quasi-angelic beings originally, had they kept to their correct place, were watching the presence of God, like cherubim, like seraphim, guarding God's presence. But there's a second possibility, which is they called them Irene watchers, not because of their role, but because of what they experienced them as doing.
yeah.
They were watching, and partly perhaps because they were God's eyes and ears on earth.
That's an interesting theory. I actually made the joke in the chat box there. The small 3 foot dark figure with spindly arms. It's a familiar shape. And ancient alien theories say yes. You know, as of course the show obviously uses as its meme. But it's true that motive, that behavior that has been witnessed and identified by people and recorded as such is a familiar motif. I've often always wondered about the similarity between people who are reporting UFO cases, or certainly the phenomena that is associated with that, and people who report out ghosts and spirituality. They often, it seems so close to each other, yet for a long time, we do put them in separate camps, but the phenomena that they are experiencing is almost the same.
Yeah, I think so. I think that for example, you can draw really interesting parallels between, say, poltergeist phenomena and UFOs. I think it's Joshua Cutchin in one of his books on Bigfoot talks about Wildnisgeist, the poltergeist of the great outdoors. And I sometimes wonder, could we be having some kind of interesting discussion about that kind of way of accounting for UFOs? And again, at root, what I call the Simwa hypothesis, something is messing with us.
Yeah, there are many who use that the trickster element that
Absolutely.
appear to be just playing with us. Are they
Yeah.
effectively bored school teenagers from the other side? Are they just in? If we may be well be in a zoo, as some hypothesists would say, and that people just come in to watch us because we are the animals that are here, are they just the kids playing around with those who are in the zoo?
Absolutely. And it's a very paranoid hypothesis, of course, but I think it was Johnny Rotten who once said, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they won't get you.
Absolutely. I guess, Caroline, I believe we have a number of questions in our fascinating chat here. Would you like to go through them, or Mark? Is there anything else you want to just jump in and hypothesize?
Well, I just wanted to touch on, follow on from what you were saying there. The feeling that you're being watched was an experiment that they did back in university. I think it was in the 70s. And then it's been recreated by Cal Cooper most recently, and he's written a paper on it. And he put a study group together, and his students had to say when they thought that they were being watched by somebody. I don't know if you've heard about that study group that was that went ahead, Mark. Have you?
No, haven't heard that one.
Yeah, it might be worth following up and having a read on that one. Even contact Cal and ask if you can have his articles and his papers from the study. But I don't know. Are we tapping in something in our subconscious, our primeval part of our brain that picks up on whether we're being watched? It's an interesting subject, and it takes me back to always having to explain this. And I say, go and have a look at the twin slit experiment on YouTube, and it explains about how these atoms are firing in this lab, and then when they put a camera on to watch it, they behave in a certain manner. Turn the camera off, and they behave unpredictably, and they go and do random stuff. Are they just behaving how they should be when they're being watched? So from having that put into my education in the paranormal, a good few years ago, I'm always thinking to myself, what happens if you've got a really high activity area and you put cameras in? Well, in the amount of investigations and cases we've had handy to us, we have seen that the cameras being switched on has a decrease in activity, or maybe not a decrease in activity, but an adjustment. So it goes to a different room that it never has been before. And this is something that we've proved here in our own house with the amount of paranormal activity we have. What's your interpretation of being watched in relation to cameras and things?
I think that we are clearly being watched by cameras. I mean, this is another thing, the ubiquity of cameras now has put us into a whole new situation as regards the paranormal. Lots of people have got cameras in their homes for security reasons. I would have expected there would be now some great poltergeist footage captured by internal cameras of stuff being chucked around. There isn't. We've got external CCTV cameras. We've got Ring doorbells. We've got the ubiquity of being filmed now. So you would expect to find some excellent UFO footage being captured by all these cameras. We haven't got it. Why not? Could it be that there was nothing in it anyway, and that the fact that we've now got camera evidence or lack of it just proves that naturalistic conclusion? Or could it be, intriguingly, that things like UFOs have modified their behavior precisely because of the ubiquity of the means to film it? Now, this puzzled me a great deal, actually, because take vehicle interference cases. I think it was Mark Rodagier from the Centre for UFO Studies, 1981, produces this huge catalogue of car-stop cases going back right to the dawn of ufology. And I was amazed. I think there's about 450 accounts of car-stop cases in his catalogue. And subsequent research turned up about another 250. All of this going up to 1981. And then, after 1981, vehicle interference cases, the number of car stop cases, they vanish. Well, they don't actually vanish, but they just reduce precipitously. And this puzzled me. Why did the car stop cases stop? Why did vehicle interference cases drop off a cliff in the early 80s? So I
Because
thought,
they're
well,
being watched by cameras.
well, this is what I thought. So I started to try and figure out when the first commercially available digital cameras emerged, because that's what I thought. That they've stopped stopping cars because they know that there's going to be someone in the car that can whip out a digital camera and film the thing hovering overhead. Okay, so the precipitous drop off in vehicle interference cases happens around 1981. The first commercially available digital cameras emerge in 1989. There's no correlation. There's almost a decade difference between the car stop cases stopping around 81 and digital cameras emerging in 1989. It's not that. So I kind of thought, well, maybe they just stopped stopping them. Just for the hell of it. Again, Simwa, something is messing with us. So they just decided, right, we're going to stop doing that now. We'll go and do something else. Trickster intelligence playing with us.
So
the information
I'll give you a little scenario of what happened in our house, because most of you that are here know that I live in a haunted house and it's pretty active. So the other day I took the dog out to the vet, came back, and I was waiting to go back and pick some meds up for from the doctors. So I sat and just watched some TV with my shoes and my coat on, just waiting. And all of a sudden, I mean, nothing seems to spark anything off in particular in our house. And I could hear this man, and he's really nasally when he speaks. So he sounds a bit whiny, like Keir Starmer when he speaks. And it was like a hello. And I thought, well, that's weird. That was coming from the kitchen. Now we've got cameras, but they're movement sensitive. And I wondered if the dog had set the camera off to actually get something. I thought that they were sound sensitive, but I found out from this experiment that they're not. But the dog was in the corridor and he moved at the same time and looked up. And obviously it goes back 10 seconds then once there's movement and captures something. And I caught the voice on the camera in the corridor rather than the kitchen where it came from. And the first thing I said was, oh, you're not so clever that you can't beat us, because the opposite camera in another room picked it up and it caught it. But the ironic thing is, my phone rang literally as this voice went, hello. And I'm looking at it and it's my really good friend calling me. Now, if it was someone like the doctor, I wouldn't have picked up the phone and gone, hello. I would have said hello in a normal voice. But when it's my really close friends, I do this, hello. And I'm wondering if what was in the house knew that my phone call was coming and was letting me know, pick up the phone. It was incredibly weird. And you can hear by the recording that I was really perplexed by it. But yeah, I definitely put that cameras recording things now tends to push the activity where the cameras aren't recording. This is just what we found from our investigations in the house. It's just weird. Can't explain it. Look at the twin slit experiment on YouTube. It will probably give you a good idea of why it misbehaves. Don't know. But thanks for listening to my little input there. We'll run through the questions for you. Christian said, how does the history of witchcraft or local folklore in the Brecon Beacons area play into the narrative of the haunting?
I mean, there was that as well. I mean, Chad Bourne talks about that in his book, and I think it was touched on in the podcast. It's another variable. Do you know what I mean? That stuff had happened in the vicinity, and again, that's a hypothesis that was put out there. I mean, people came into the house, as I said towards the beginning of the talk. They had an absolute parade of experts coming in, and amongst those were those who were basically saying, yeah, you know, stuff happened here, and the location is the thing. So yeah, that's definitely covered in the literature. Absolutely.
He goes on to say, were there any psychological or environmental factors that could have contributed to the experiences reported by the Rich family?
Yeah, I think the actual dynamic itself. Again, if you replace the either or with the both and, for want of a better phrase, this was a deeply dysfunctional family. But by their own admission, you know, even before they arrived, they were unhappy, and while they were there, they got unhappier still. And then the house with everything that was going on there, just contributed to the unhappiness. So I think the psychological dynamic is absolutely at the heart of the Heol Fanog case, but as I tried to show in my talk, not the only factor, the
No,
place
definitely not.
itself. So you
Mm.
might have 20 families living in a house like that. With 19 of them, nothing happens. With the 20th, the blue touch paper gets lit. I think it's both and, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you on that one. Julie Elizabeth Boyd said, "How old is the house? What's the history of the former occupants, and is it occupied now?"
I think it is occupied now because the occupants got in touch with Danny Robbins when the podcast came out and said, the only mystery here are the mysteries of nature. The house itself actually looks pretty nondescript. I would say that was probably built in the 50s. Again, whatever was on that site previous, I don't know, but nothing remarkable about the actual house in any way.
We had obviously a few of the problems with the sound. Andy said, "We all know what's going to happen. You're going to get to the exciting conclusion after an hour and it'll cut out." Well, I'm
Really
glad
odd
that we
actually
didn't
because
have
we've
that
we've never
problem.
had any problems at all with the with
Ooh.
the with the bandwidth here. Everything is tickety boo. That's the first time it's ever happened. I can't explain that. I was
Well,
doing a
sometimes if I'm hosting and mine goes out, and I lose bandwidth, it can because I'm hosting, but I've got incredible bandwidth tonight. So I don't know, all of my pods are active and are working correctly. So I don't know what happened. Apologies for that, Mark.
it could have been this end, but it's just very very odd. But yeah, who knows? Tech is not my strong point, so I could be completely wrong.
Nor mine. But we managed to get through that with turning the video off and whatever else that you did on the side as well. It seemed to work. But thanks for bearing with everybody. Um, Mike Benbow Jackson said, "Could we consider this as a person rather than a place haunting? Sorry if it's already been covered."
Yeah, I mean, it's again both and I think that, but these people, I think were contributing, but not the only factor.
Yeah. He goes on to say, "Good example of possible both, not either or when it comes to a place or person binary, and it's gripping."
Yeah, yeah. So I think if people are investigators really need to just be aware that things happen on two levels really. You have to consider the dynamic of the people or the person who is living there, plus the place where they're living. That's all.
Yeah. Um, Christian Lander said, "Has he's always been interested about how what is apparent phenomena builds from just simple sounds to much, much more."
Yeah, that's a good question. I would be interested to know that because it looks as if things did build at Hale Fanog. First of all, they're just having problems with the electricity. And then after Lawrence has gone, Liz Rich is having this terrifying encounter with this black figure. It may have peaked. It could be that. Yeah, it
Do you
starts
think
slowly
if
and
it's
grows.
if do you think if it's person centered, as the family all buy into the validity of what's going on, that creates more of a connection with more energy that they're putting into it?
Yeah, and then they get more and more distressed, and the phenomena just gets fed, and it just
Yeah.
gets worse and worse. It's almost like a mutual kind of reciprocal thing, almost.
And I do have, we found that with investigating ourselves. Friday, Saturday nights could be more active with more people home from work, having family dynamics, like you say, an argument after a glass of wine. Things get heated, and maybe poltergeist, if it is poltergeist activity, does increase. So yeah, but I definitely think that once the family start becoming aware of what it is that's going on, it's the energy building due to them, um, thinking, and then they become paranoid and they hear things and they think, well, is that something? And of course, it instills fear into them.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so
Yeah.
the whole thing just builds, and then in the case of the Riches, of course, it kind of stopped. Again, that's interesting. Not just why do these things happen and how do they start, but why do they, how do they end? Because it seems
Yeah,
that a lot of the interventions, and they had a whole parade of people going through the house, nothing seemed to work. The phenomena just decided to stop. And again, a bit like the cessation of vehicle interference cases, there's no rhyme or reason to it. It's almost as if the trickster is a shapeshifter. But something can shapeshift in two senses. I mean, it can literally shapeshift in as much as the shape of something can change, but it can also shapeshift in terms of the way in which it behaves. That's a form of
definitely.
shapeshifting too.
Yeah.
And if we're just dealing with some kind of vicarious trickster intelligence that is winding us up for whatever reason, then we are going to struggle really to find any logical consistency behind any of it.
We could drive ourselves crazy trying to find out answers in our lifetime. And
Yeah.
are we ever going to find an answer?
Yeah, I don't think we are, you see. That's the problem, isn't it? That we're all here and we're all absolutely fascinated by these phenomena and we are forever asking questions. And in the back of our minds, we know we will never get any answers, but still we do it.
Yeah. I
Then
don't know
again, we
why.
might.
It's a bug, isn't it? We have that interest. We want to experience. We want to feel. Is it because we want to have the knowledge and the reassurance that there is something after death? Is that what we're chasing?
I think we do. I think that one thing that absolutely terrifies us, particularly in a secular Western culture like our own, that there's nothing beyond it, that we are just squishy biology, and when we die nothing carries on, nothing has any ultimate meaning. So nihilism and despair are the only responses. We don't want to capitulate to that, so we are desperately trying to find some kind of proof that there is something else. uh,
Yeah.
we are trying to transcend nihilism. We are trying to transcend existentialism, but we're not going down the tried and tested religious and spiritual roads because for whatever reason we've made up our minds that there's nothing in those. So we look somewhere else. We look to anomalistics. We look to parapsychology in the hope that perhaps they will deliver us from our nihilism and despair. Um, but again, I think we're probably finding that the questions we ask don't have answers. But then again, I think that some of the traditional religious answers that our secular Western culture has turned its back on actually have validity. I think we probably have to unlearn everything that we've learned about some of these religions and religious people and see if we can't still find something valuable within these now neglected traditions, because I think it's there.
Yeah, I agree totally. I look forward to finding out more from your investigations on that side. Um, Ashleen said she's a bit skeptical about Witch Farm because she had heard from somebody that it was a hoax. Have you heard this comment?
No, well, certainly people thought that the riches might have been behind it, or that they'd for whatever reason decided to perpetuate some sort of hoax. Chad Bourne in his book seems very clear that there was something going on. The family, I think if they're just making it all up, that might be even more incredible than to conclude that there was some genuine phenomena there. But I think whenever you get something like Heol Fanog, you're always going to get the skeptical input, which says, "Well, come on now, this is just entire fabrication."
Yeah, you,
Sometimes
you
it's
you will
hard
have
not
the
to be a skeptic.
skeptics.
Yeah,
Yeah. I
yeah,
think the more that I have been investigating and the more that I have been in the paranormal, the more skeptical I'm becoming. But
absolutely.
I still have an open mind that I look at things skeptically and I try to find valid, easy, explainable reasons why things have happened. But yes, Martin even said the other day, my husband said, I think I don't believe in ghosts anymore. And I'm like, what? You have to keep your mind open.
Mhm.
So, we've really come a huge journey in the years that we've been investigating. But yeah, something happened in the house that brought him straight back to believing in the paranormal again. So yeah, I think it does that, doesn't it? It takes you on your own circle where you gaslight yourself. Did I see that? Did I hear that? And you try to find so many reasonable explanations. You By the time that you've talked yourself around, you've talked yourself out of actually experiencing anything at all in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the fair play to the skeptics. A lot of the time, the conclusions they draw are absolutely and completely valid. The
Yeah.
skeptics are often right. It just
Mm.
seems to me that they stop asking questions where the really interesting questions start. And that's a shame.
Yeah. That's why I'm going to stay open-minded. So I'll have that little bit of me that's available to see things on a bigger scale, I think. Um, Julie Elizabeth Boyd said in the movie Presence, the story is seen from the eyes of the poltergeist spirit who watches the family and moves through the house observing everything. I don't think I've seen that film, but yeah. It- Have you ever heard, Mark, in poltergeist cases, being in a property or having transference via contagion, that if you're going to say something, it knows what you're going to say before you say it?
Yeah. Yeah, I think watching, they watch in two senses. They watch externally and they watch internally. I think somehow, and I come across this over and over again, they know what we're thinking. And I think that's why UFOs can be so elusive. They know what the observer's doing.
So my
They know what
husband's
the
a psych.
observer's doing. And that's why often people have not been able to see the exact point at which the poltergeist actually moves something. You know, they'll see the object in motion, but they won't
Yeah.
actually see the object starting because these things have a kind of quasi omniscience. They know. They don't just see, they know. And
So
again,
my husband's a psychotherapist, and he's explained to me in a way that I understand now that your brain synapses and your electronic, um, you know, messages that it sends to the brain happen so quickly. By the time that you've actually used your mouth and the words come out, you've thought about it 0.2 seconds beforehand, and then it knows because it's reading your internal thought process. And the way that he explained it was made total sense that if it does, poltergeist is from the person centered, you're creating this energy yourself. Obviously, for example, if you would say something like, oh, isn't it interesting how we don't have anything paranormal happen in the kitchen anymore? And then something happens in the kitchen just as you're about to say it.
yeah,
It
yeah.
it explains that.
Yeah, I think it does. And also, we might be also exploring the distinction between the one and the many. It's almost as if one of them knows something, they all know it. Again, the singular and the plural in these cases is extremely interesting. I remember doing conducting a seminar a long time ago, and there was a chap in the group, and he was a voice hearer. He would hear voices, and he'd been diagnosed as having schizophrenia. Um, and I've often wondered about schizophrenia. My very best friend from school days was diagnosed with schizophrenia at the end of the 1980s. I've observed his condition. I've seen schizophrenia more up close than I would ever want to see it. And at the end of the day, I don't know what it is. I mean, it's not like a diagnosis of Parkinson's. It's a functional diagnosis, schizophrenia. It's just a kind of shorthand way of labeling how people behave. It says nothing about the actual etiology of schizophrenia. Not like Parkinson's. We know what causes that. That's why you can give people dopamine to take away the symptoms. But there's nothing really that removes schizophrenia in the same way. And this chap was in my seminar group, and he was a voice hearer. And at the end of the group, he came up to me And he said, the voices were talking to me all the way through your group. And I said, oh, yeah. And he said, would you like me to show you what they were saying? Because he was writing it down on a pad. He said, would you like me to show you what they were saying during this particular seminar group? I said, well, yes, I would. So he held out his pad and he showed me it. Every single statement, we, 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 we. First person plural. Yeah, he wasn't hearing a voice that said I. He was hearing a voice that was kind of, we this, we that. And I've often wondered, why would that be? Why would those auditory hallucinations all start with the first person plural?
Is it because in cases of schizophrenia, they normally have multifaceted personalities that they hear?
I don't know. I think that might be to confuse schizophrenia with multiple personality disorder. You see, schizophrenia doesn't seem to be characterized by, first of all, you're one personality, then you're another, then you're another. All the definitions I've seen of it seem to be some other thing.
Mm.
So, but again, that's the thing with functional diagnoses. They lack that kind of etiological precision.
Yeah, I don't know a great deal about schizophrenia, so it's interesting to hear your thought process on it. Um,
Again, you see,
mm,
in a culture like our own, where we long for secular interpretations of things, of course, we're going to try and account for what we call schizophrenia in terms of brain processes. But of course, when Jesus is walking the earth, and he gets into the region of the Gadarenes, and he gets out of the boat, and the man who is living amongst the tombs, who cuts himself with stones, comes towards Jesus, and they have this kind of spiritual showdown. And Jesus says to the man, "What's your name? What's your name?" And the man says, "We are legion, for there are many of us." We. See, we wouldn't interpret that in terms of any kind of demonic thing. We would interpret it using the word like schizophrenia. Now, I'm not for a minute saying that every person who is being diagnosed with a condition that is psychosis is demon possessed. What I'm simply saying is that the dominant secular Western paradigms may be blinding us to other interpretations of these conditions that might be more fruitful in terms of at least understanding what causes them.
yeah, thank you for explaining that. Kieran Farrell's very kind, and he said it was Rupert Sheldrake who looked at the sense of being stared at originally, and then Christian Land has also put Professor Cal Cooper's sense of being stared at with a YouTube link. So if anybody needs to see that later, give me a message and I can send you the link, or just look for it. Cal Cooper, the sense of being stared at, or Rupert Sheldrake looked at the sense of being stared at. So that's the two of those. Yeah, interesting to watch the clip that I did. It might be something that people would be interested in watching as well. I'm trying to find some more questions for you. Dan H, I think we were talking about the being watched still. Dan H said, I think it was in relation to cameras not picking things up. He said it suggests that the phenomenon is a quantum effect, which, when observed, collapses and the probability and disrupts the phenomenon. Or that could have been about the twin slit experiment that he was referring to that. The question is, if a camera films something but nothing watches the camera, does this act as an observer or not?
Yeah, I, sometimes when, to go back to the earlier point, sometimes when quantum physics is being called in to explain some of these mysteries, it's almost like we're trying to explain a mystery by positing a greater mystery, and that
Yeah.
hasn't really got us anywhere. So I think that's it really, and I think it's really all about, in terms of observation. Um, if they're the ones who were doing the observing, they see more than we do, I think. if this watcher thing has got any mileage in it, and
Mm.
if these things are genuinely modifying their behavior because they're aware that we might see what happens, then I think they're the ones who seem to have the greater knowledge.
Um, as for the cars stopping, the engines in 1981, it kind of ceasing its behavior, Dan says the question is if, sorry, could the change be due to moving from mechanical distributors to electronic ignition?
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting one. It might be something to do with the way that cars have undergone differences in design and construction over the years. I've spoken to engineers about this, and again, there's no real consensus, but that should definitely be on the table. Absolutely.
So we were talking to somebody the other day about this actual scenario itself, and particularly in diesel cars, that there didn't seem to be the diesel cars that didn't seem to cut out. But Martin used to have a massive, huge interest in mechanics in cars. And he said, well, could it just be that diesels have an idle? That's, it doesn't ever stop kind of thing. It always ticks over like a tractor engine, and was
Yeah.
trying to explain it. So they wouldn't seize, they wouldn't stall.
Yeah, I mean, Rodigian makes that point actually. I think he said, diesels aren't stopped, but petrol cars are. There was no follow up done on that. I think that would have been extremely interesting because
Yeah.
that throws a whole new hue on the whole thing, doesn't it?
Well, maybe we could set up an investigative group within ASSAP to look at something like that. If you
Yeah,
wanted to head that one up, Mark,
yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah, very much so.
yeah, start a
Yeah,
new project off.
yeah, yeah. Because I
Um,
mean, the literature is huge. The literature is massive, and again, the notion of a spiritual component to some of these strange events is only one of many hypotheses. Of course, the other one that's extremely interesting is, and this kind of arises from the research I've done on olfaction and unusual experiences, is of course the most commonly reported smells associated with UFO close encounters, which are, of course, sulfur, which is interesting because, of course, sulfur doesn't smell. Sulfur only smells when it forms a compound. So, if a person sees a craft that has landed in a clearing and is suddenly overwhelmed by the smell of sulfur, you've got various hypotheses, really. Number one, it's the craft itself that's producing the smell. But there's a possibility that number two, or I say craft, I'm just using that in inverted commas. Number two, it could be something to do with the way that the object is interacting with the atmosphere around the witness that is producing a compound such as sulfur dioxide or hydrogen sulfide. So again, these are interesting things that could be examined because, of course, the smell of sulfur again has long been associated with kind of demonic and quasi-demonic entities. And isn't it interesting that far and away the most commonly reported smell by those who have experienced UFO close encounters has been sulfur?
that's another thing I didn't know. I think I need to go and research more into UFOs. It's not a subject that I've looked at very much. So this is an incredibly interesting talk, taking us all down these rabbit holes. Um, have a look for the next question for you. Dan H again, from the perspective of one who suffers from autism, most of the diagnostic criteria are now, or not the conditions as such, but how the brain tries to compensate for the actual problem in one's brain. I think that was talking about the split personality disorder that you were talking about.
Yeah, I'm
I
not sure of that.
No, maybe they just try and compensate, as he said, filling in the gaps the lack of understanding.
Yeah.
Um, trying to find rather than just another question. Back to cars again with Dan. He said the older diesels were almost entirely mechanical, no power needed for fuel pump, injector pump, or indeed anything. If the battery failed, then the solenoid to cut off the fuel, stop the engine would fail, and you'd have an ever running diesel engine. Do you know, it takes a guy, not a girl with blonde hair, to explain that one. Thank you very much. Martin did a really good job of telling me the other day, but I couldn't remember the wording correctly why they carry on running. But that would probably explain then why there were very little reports when UFOs have been stopped to diesel cars have never been affected by them. Yeah,
I'd like to see more research done on that. I do really think that's a very, very fruitful area. Yeah.
So if anybody would like to be involved in a project, I'm sure Christian wouldn't mind heading up with Mark if he was wanting to be involved, and anyone else. If you send your interest through to who can we send it through to? Send it through to webinars@assap.ac.uk if you want to be involved in a project looking at the differences in UFOs with diesel and petrol engines. And we'll see if we can put you in touch with people that's like-minded and see if we can get a focus group to look at that. It's a good idea.
I think it's really
we need to start getting back to investigating again.
Yeah, exactly.
Go on, Christian.
No, really, that's exactly what we should be doing. So should be less focused on these political matters and actually getting some research, publishing some documents, and getting some content out there that actually is pushing these fields of the phenomena forward. You know, what are we doing? I think that is a really worthwhile area. And just on this very, very topic, I mean, in the newest issue of Seriously Strange that everyone received tonight at 7:15, there's actually an article by Ian Liston Smith about diesel and petrol engines and do UAPs affect them differently. That is actually an article in the magazine available tonight. So if you're an ASSAP member, you've just received that. So have a read of that and, put your thoughts together. Maybe we can come up, like you said, a focus group. Maybe we can do some tests on perhaps how that's done. And I believe that article actually has some experimentation ideas too.
Yeah. I've just been told off by somebody who I admire greatly in the messenger. I haven't forgotten you. I've kept the one till the last because I was going to unmute you to ask it yourself. Rob Gandy, please go ahead.
Hi, Mark. Good to see you.
Hi, Rob. And you?
Oh, hang on. I've got my feet all tied up. It was Christian Lander highlighted the thing about small 3-foot dark figure with spindly arms and the like. And it triggered something that I read very recently. And so I took the opportunity to actually go and get an old It Happened to Me book because I'd marked it. And it is remarked that there's this, genuine case testimony, which parallels are quite amazing. So I was just wondering, do you want me to quickly read it to you?
Yes, we'd love that.
Okay, there's a guy who's fixing his car. This is out in South Dakota. And he said, so forgive me reading, 2 trailers down from ours, 2 women and a man were arguing in front of the trailer. They were so loud we could hear everything they said. I reached down by my front tire to grab a ratchet from the toolbox, and I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. What I saw startled me. I froze. I can't exactly describe what I saw. A small black thing was walking down the grass trail behind the trailers. That's the best I can explain it. It was maybe 3 foot tall with skinny legs and arms. It had a faceless head and it walked like a human. But it didn't look like a ghost or anything. It was black, as if there was a hole in the air, as if it were a nothingness swallowing light. I've never seen such a complete blackness since. I don't think it noticed me. I watched in astonishment as it walked up to a tree about as big around as a coffee can and put its arms around the trunk and stood there watching the people who were arguing. I couldn't believe my eyes. The thing was so black that it looked as if the tree had a black hole in it. It seemed to be enjoying itself. Maybe it liked anger. Maybe it brought anger. All this happened in a couple of minutes. One of the other guys said something to me and I snapped out of my trance. "What the hell is that?" I asked quietly, pointing at the thing still standing behind the tree. Then I threw the ratchet at it, and the thing jumped and spun its head around. I'd surprised it. I don't think I was supposed to see it. I think it forgot to hide itself. We ran into the trailer and never saw it again, except, like I said, in my dreams. I just thought that was
I think that's the longer version. I think
Oh, is it?
what I had was an extract from that very account. I think that's just
Oh,
the
right.
longer
So
version. But the ending is
sorry,
interesting
I
as well.
misunderstood. I thought that it was a separate one, which
No, I think that's the same. But the ending
ah,
is the longer version is, I think, also interesting for what happens at the end. Absolutely.
yeah, because they are of Native American descent. He says some of the people I've told the story to say it was a water spirit. Some say it was a bad spirit, an evil one, and refers to it as black devils. Yeah,
Yeah.
I hope that helps.
Yeah, great. Thank you very, very much for that, Rob. Loved hearing that. Christian, would you like to unmute yourself? Mark, again, thank you very much from ASSAP and all the members this evening for your incredible talk. I've learned a lot tonight, as I hope all of you have. Christian, would you like to do a follow-up?
No, it's actually what has been said here tonight. I think this is actually a really good, positive ASSAP webinar. I think we've actually come away from this actually having learned something. We've examined, which farm is which farm. We've discussed UFOs, ghosts, and the kind of the weirdness in between them and the interconnectedness that is there. And I think moving forward into some kind of research project, what we can all actually participate in is wonderful. So, who actually is next week's speaker?
Oh, crikey. Just bear with me for 1 second. I haven't been that well prepared where I've been reading the questions out. So next week we have Andy Guy, personal friend of mine. Don't know if you know him. He is incredible in the paranormal field and he makes and tests bits of equipment, really scientific bits of equipment. So next week, his talk is going to be practical applications of data logging. And he uses multiple areas of input to gain data, and then he creates some kind of focus. So he'll explain it better in his techie terms. He's brilliant. If you ask him to create a bit of kit that can do something, he can have a go at it for you. So looking forward to hosting him next week.
Excellent.
Thank you.